Today, I'm so excited to welcome my special guest, Megan Sheldon. Megan is the co founder of Be Ceremonial, the world's first guided ritual and ceremony app. Megan is a cultural mythologist, humanist celebrant, and end of life doula living and working in North Vancouver, British Columbia. She has created hundreds of ceremonies for people around the world, focusing on what she calls the seemingly invisible moments of change, such as pregnancy loss, organ transplantation, menopause, living funerals, and death anniversaries. Megan offers online workshops, virtual courses, and seasonal retreats in British Columbia. And you can learn more about all of her work at the website beceremonial.com, and that's beceremonial.com. So, Megan, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Karen. I'm so excited for us to have this conversation.
Yes, me too. Ever since, we had a preliminary phone call, and ever since then, I've thought nonstop about the importance of rituals and ceremonies after we talked about it. So I've been looking forward to sharing that information with our audience. But maybe you could start, just give us a little overview of your own path and how you ended up becoming an end of life doula and then focusing on rituals and ceremonies.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to have hindsight and to look back on your life and to see where all those paths came together and the threads that have been woven together over time. I think for most of my life, I felt like I was floundering a little bit. I was trying on a lot of different careers, a lot of different opportunities. I think in my 20s and my 30s, I had 30 different business cards with my name on it. So for me, it
Oh.
was, I started my career as a journalist and then I worked in public relations and marketing. In my 20s, I moved to Scotland and I did a master's in cultural mythology. I've always been drawn to myth and folklore and storytelling. I was raised atheist, so I am a humanist. I am not religious. And for me, that often meant that I didn't think I had access to ritual and ceremony. I'm spiritual to a sense, but I'm not overly woo-woo kind of in the spiritual world. So I also didn't necessarily have access to rituals and ceremonies through the metaphysical world. So my time in Scotland, first of all, it gave me the gift of studying my own lineage, my own heritage. I had letters from my great grandparents that I was able to read and travel up into Inverness and find out where they lived and were born and connect with something. I think as a Canadian, as a North American, a lot of us who aren't from this land, we are seeking something, a connection to something bigger. And I think over time, the last few hundred years, especially as communities move away from religion and cultural traditions, we often feel quite lost, especially when big and hard things happen. We don't quite know what to do with that. And so my time in Scotland studying mythology really opened up the door to the universality of ritual and ceremony and that kind of collective unconscious, the fact that we are naturally ceremonial. We have this inside of us. I don't believe that we need to be taught. I instead say that we just need time to remember. And part of remembering for me is having conversations like this, showing by example. I host a lot of ceremonies in my community, and people will come and say, "Oh, I didn't even realize that was a ceremony." That's so powerful. So yeah, that was my kind of twist and turns. And then as life and death happens, my husband and I went through a time of great loss. His father was given a terminal diagnosis with ALS, and we were at the same time planning our wedding. And I really wanted to create space within our wedding for the grief that we were feeling. This would be the only time that our two families would be together, intact, whole. His family was coming from Sweden, my family here in Vancouver. And it was such an interesting thing to have people push up against the idea of having grief present at a wedding. So many people said, no, no, it's a happy day. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't, don't make it sad. Just focus on the positives. And in a lot of ways, that feels like gaslighting, right? It feels like, I was telling them I really wanted to create space for grief, and people are quite uncomfortable with that. We live in a grief phobic society a lot of the times. And what it ended up doing by carving out space within our wedding ceremony for the grief and sadness and fear that all of us were holding, it validated it, right? It allowed it to move and be acknowledged and honored in some way. Over the next couple of years, my husband and I had recurrent pregnancy loss. So again, these invisible moments, not only around the loss itself, but reaching a due date. I had several friends that I was pregnant with, and when I would lose the pregnancy and they would go on, there were so many moments that I would witness that would swell my own grief and bring it to the surface. And we're not taught what to do in those moments. We don't have rituals for what to do on an anticipated due date when you don't have a baby in hand, or when you know it's going to be your child's third birthday, but they're not here anymore. So I got really curious about these rituals and ceremonies that exist across time, across culture. And I became a life cycle celebrant. I became an end of life doula. And I just started to get curious and create ceremonies for myself, and then for friends, and then friends of friends. And then suddenly I was being, people were reaching out from Europe and Australia and asking me to help them create ceremonies around very specific and often unrecognized milestones and rites of passage. So things like organ transplantation, the journey with dementia. So I was helping women create ceremonies when they were going to see their mom after their mom had been given a dementia diagnosis. And at this point, that maybe their mom had forgotten who they were and they wanted to create a ceremony to kind of grieve that previous relationship and create space for a new one. So yeah, it's been a long and winding road, but here I am. I'm about to turn 44 next week, and I feel like it's just starting. I feel like I'm just grazing the surface of what's possible when we reimagine ritual in our own lives.
I love how you kind of opened the door and then suddenly realized, well, there are opportunities for rituals everywhere. I mean, they belong everywhere in our lives at all these little moments of change. We just, like you said, we forgot the importance of it, and even forgot how to do it. Although maybe who knows, we create little rituals anyway for ourselves without realizing we have rituals.
100%. And that's when people come through my training, the number one thing I hear all the time is, oh, I didn't even realize it, but I'm so ceremonial. I already have ritual. And I know that moment's going to come for everybody because we do. Like my family has Sunday morning waffles every week and we have since we were little. And that's actually a ritual in my family. And we didn't realize it was a ritual until the pandemic kind of took it away. And then my dad adopted it and he would drop off all the waffle fixings and, special batter, the secret ingredients that he never tells anyone. He would drop it off at my brother's and my doorstep so we could continue to have our waffles every Sunday morning. And maybe we would join, virtually or bring our little FaceTime out and talk with each other. But that became such an important ritual in our family, this idea of having this Sunday morning tradition, and there's certain conversations that come up. So without a doubt, we all have ritual in our lives. I think when you look at the Wikipedia kind of, thesaurus definition of ritual, it's not my definition. It's something that you'll see words like repeated and religious and rigid. It needs to follow a certain order, prescribed. And for me, I just kind of threw that out and said, yes, there's a role for that type of ritual, especially in religious and cultural settings. And there's also an opportunity over here to be playful and creative. Try a ritual on once, and maybe you never do it again. You don't have to do it at the same time every day. You can do it when you feel called, when your kind of emotional responses are needed. And that, I think, really opened me up to the idea of what ritual could be.
Mm. I love how the Sunday morning waffles, those little things that we do for fun and pleasure, and it's partly the time and consistency that we invest in doing them. But then those same rituals were there during a time of hardship when the pandemic came, and they still continue to carry us through. We just find ways to adapt them. I think that's really one of the reasons I think to create rituals for all the positive times in our
Yeah.
lives too, because we'll have those available to us for future reference.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic did give us that gift. I know it's always hard to see that as a gift in the midst of it because so many of us felt so isolated and alone, and especially in the end of life work. I, along with a colleague, Christina Andriola from New Narrative Memorials, we created the first virtual celebration of life in Canada and possibly in North America. But we were, I think, 2 weeks into the pandemic when somebody reached out and asked if we could create a Zoom memorial, and we had never heard of that before. And we ended up creating something so powerful and so meaningful. And by no means was it better or worse than had it been in person. It was different. And I think what people started to realize was they could let go of some of the rituals that were no longer meaningful to them, and they could hone in and amplify the rituals that were meaningful, which is often about storytelling. And I think that's why I'm drawn to this work, my background in journalism and writing and mythology. Really, ceremony and ritual is a time for us to share our stories, to witness each other, to come together and have those connections, that feeling of belonging. That for me is the magic of it all. And so a lot of the other things that kind of have been prescribed down, I think about all the weddings and funerals that I've been to over the years, and a lot of them look the same. And while there is some comfort in that, do they need to? Like, what are we missing? How are we missing on making things unique and personal to the person that we're actually honoring?
Mm. Well, as I listened to you talk and I looked at your website, I thought about ritual was kind of a missing piece for me when I was working in hospice because there were so many times sitting with a family or at the bedside with a patient where I just knew like we need to do something. There needs to be something else here. But I myself at that time, I didn't know enough about the value of ritual or have ideas or even feel like it was permissible, I guess, to suggest a ritual to a family. And looking back, I see how valuable ritual would have been during those times. And just as a hospice worker, to be able to maybe offer something very simple or very small to a family that might have helped them in the moment.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot, and I felt that way too. And I think that's why Johan, my husband, and I created the app, Be Ceremonial. He works in tech, and we found ourselves in the pandemic, kind of people reaching out from all over the world, wanting ideas and inspiration, and people saying, "Where do I start?" Like I'm about to go and be with my grandma as she prepares to die. Like, what can I do for her? Or, hospice volunteers and end of life doulas were reaching out. And so we created the app as kind of a choose your own ritual adventure. It's not prescribed. You don't need to follow it as a script. It's meant to open the door and give people, here are 20 or 30 different ideas that you can do while you're sitting vigil, sitting bedside with someone as they prepare to die. Or here are 20 or 30 different things that you can do after somebody dies and how you can care for their body and how you can honor that space and the stories and love and emotions that you feel. And I think that's what we're missing is because we live in this death denying culture where, for the most part, death has been taken away from us. It's taken away from the community and kind of put behind a medicalized kind of system and structure. And we've lost that connection to having, somebody's body in our home after they die and caring for it and bathing it and anointing it and being with it. And I often say that it's just this sense of urgency that happens when somebody dies. We think we have to do something right away, and we forget that sometimes the best thing we can do is just slow down and pause, pour a cup of tea, maybe turn some music on, turn on a favorite song, and just honor that pause, that slowness, rather than rushing through that time.
Mm. I love that. Well, tell me a little bit more about how the app works because I haven't seen the app itself. But if I were sitting at bedside, it's on your phone, right? It's a smartphone app.
It
Um,
is, yeah.
what might I find there? I mean, does it have readings or poetry or something within the app that I could find? Or just tell me.
Yeah, so the app does a lot of things. As a life cycle celebrant, I create ceremonies for people across the life cycle, so not just around death and dying, although that's usually where people find us because they're in that time of grief and loss is often when people feel the greatest urgency and need for ceremony. But within the app, you can find daily rituals. So there's small, simple things that you can do to weave into your morning or your evening. There's rituals to acknowledge grief and anger and boundary setting and burnout. And though they take about 5 minutes or less. And that part of the app for me is about building our ritual muscles. So I
Mm,
often say the worst time in the world to have to plan a ceremony is when you need to do it in the midst of kind of a chaotic time. Whereas if we start to build our ritual muscles before they're needed, when it comes time to go through something difficult, something hard, like the death of a loved one, we already have these ritual muscles that we've been building up. We have this relationship and language that we can draw on. So the daily rituals in the app are meant to do that. They're meant to just kind of to start to help you flex those muscles and remember that you have this inside of you. A ritual can look so different for each of us. And so we give everybody lots of ideas and examples to choose from with the invitation to make it their own. So again, it's not prescriptive. You don't have to follow it exactly as it's written. It's more of just again, opening that door. And then there's the build your own ceremony part of the app, which a ceremony kind of has five distinct stages. There's the opening ritual, so how you open the space so that everybody in the room, or if it's just yourself, you know that you've now stepped over the threshold and you're in a sacred space, right? A ceremony kind of has that feeling of I'm talking to somebody about the weather and we're catching up, and then something happens where we intentionally step into the ceremonial container. And there's beautiful little rituals that you can do, like playing a special song or having everybody take a couple deep breaths. You can actually physically cross over a threshold. You can do something together that allows you to open that ceremonial space. And then you're going to move through the traditional rite of passage. Often we choose a ritual to separate and let go of what was. This is often that release ritual. So you might write down something on a piece of paper. If it's around a loved one who had died, you might want to write them a letter and either burn it in the fire or write it on special dissolving paper that you place into water. Again, there's in the app, if you're choosing, say it's a living funeral or a sitting vigil ceremony, there's lots of choices. So you can kind of browse through all these different rituals and pick and choose the ones that are meaningful to you. And then you choose a ritual to be present, to acknowledge exactly what is in this moment and not rushing. This is the thing that I think we struggle with the most in our current society. And it's as a celebrant and ceremonialist, it's where I really invite people to dig deeper is what's something that you can do in the midst of your ceremony that's going to allow everybody to just settle their nervous systems, connect with their breath, connect with eye contact. I'm holding hands. I remember back at my wedding with my husband, we did a ring warming ceremony, a ritual where we passed our rings along in a shell on the beach. We were in the midst of a Tofino storm in the west coast of British Columbia, and it was pouring rain. And, we're 24 people on the beach in a circle, and you could kind of see everybody looking like, are we going to really stay out here the whole time? But the wild storm weather was part of our ceremony. We wanted to be there in the midst of a storm, and we passed these rings around. And my sister-in-law's blind. So I remember her getting the shell with the rings and holding them in her hand and blessing them with love. And I got to witness her. It's 11 years later or 12 years later, and I can still remember that moment of her holding our rings and just infusing them with love. And that moment is crystal clear for me. Whereas if I hadn't have done a ritual that would have allowed me to connect with each of those 24 people, my father-in-law, him holding those rings, I could just feel the love emulating through him. And I think back to that moment, I could have missed that. I could have missed that slowing down, that settling. And yes, it took a little longer than we thought. And yes, the wind was whipping around us and the rain was coming. But that's the moment of my wedding that I remember with so much clarity. So again, thinking about the rituals that slow us down, invite us to pause. And then you choose a ritual that's going to carry you forward. So helping you acknowledge what will be. This is often around legacy, memory keeping. There's a beautiful ritual in the app that I love to do with families around wisdom stones. So placing stones in the person who's dying's hand and asking them to share, if they're able to at that point, something that they learned in their life. And they imbue that wisdom into that stone. And then maybe you can write on the stone a word or a sentence. And then at the end, you have this little basket of rocks that holds their wisdom, and you get to bring that with you. And so maybe the following year on a death anniversary or on their birthday or the first Christmas without them, you can bring that basket of wisdom rocks out with you and hold them and reconnect with both the love and intention that was imbued into that stone, but also the way they live their life, their legacy. And then we close our ceremony. So choosing a ritual to open and then close our ceremony is almost as critical because we need to know through our parasympathetic nervous systems that, okay, this is over now. We can't stay in a ceremonial setting all the time. It's exhausting and it won't be meaningful. So what do you do to allow people? Maybe it's chiming a bell. Maybe it's taking, cheersing and everybody having a drink of some tea or some champagne, something special, but something that allows us to say, okay, the ceremony is now over. I can relax a little and step back out and go on and have some downtime. And So the app guides you through how to kind of design and create that ceremony. You can choose as many rituals as you want, but we do kind of give you a bit of inspiration and ideas.
Mm.
So yeah.
Wow, that's so beautiful. And I was thinking, as like a hospice worker or end of life doula, there might be a few tools that you want to add into the kit of things that you bring with you when you make visits, so that you have some things available to you to utilize for those rituals, just so you have some raw materials there.
Yeah.
Paper and pens, or I
Yeah.
mean, just a few things that you bring along so that they're at hand, and to facilitate creating some rituals.
Yeah, and a big part of the app, the way that Johan and I designed it, because I'm a big believer in the gift economy. I love gifting things to people. It's one of my love languages. So with your membership to the app, which is very affordable, and it's just meant to give people, again, so many tools, but you can also gift a ceremony. So if you're working with a family and you're supporting a family, and you don't necessarily feel like the one to kind of lead or introduce them to these rituals, you can just open up the app and get their email address and gift them the ceremony, and then they can go through and pick and choose the rituals that feel right to them. And maybe
Mm,
they don't do it that day, maybe they do it the week later or at some other point. But being able to gift somebody that invitation to think about ritual and ceremony, I think it's been a huge response back from, the end of life care providers that do use our app. And then the other part that's really important for end of life care providers, and I will continue to sorry, we're having an earthquake. Johan,
I,
we're having an earthquake.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I see the camera shaking.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Whew. I thought it was thunder at first.
We
Anyway,
might
hopefully we can edit this part out.
We can, unless we want to
Okay.
add an earthquake
Unless
ritual.
we want an earthquake ritual. The whole house just started to shake. Wow.
Wow. Is everything okay if you feel like you
Yeah,
need to go?
it must have been a small one. It must have been like a 4 or 5. Wow. Anyway.
Wow, that's a first.
That is a
I've
first.
never had an earthquake happen during an interview.
Um, yeah, I think we're okay. If another one happens, I will tune out
Okay.
and close off.
Yeah. Okay.
So I was saying, oh, yes. So the other part that I'm really passionate about is care providers and how we do this work, especially in the end of life work, and what are the rituals we do for ourselves. Because I think burnout, compassion fatigue, all of these things are so real, especially now as our healthcare system is being challenged in so many different ways. How do we support ourselves and support each other? Because I am not a fan of the word self-care. I think it's, especially as a working mom with, a neighbor, a friend, a community, self-care can be almost impossible when you're in the thick of it, especially when you're nearing burnout. So community care becomes so important. And so there's so many rituals in the app that are meant for care providers to acknowledge what they're holding before they step into a space to support a family. So the other day I was doing a celebration of life for a young mom who died of cancer, and I could feel my own worries, my own fears kind of stepping in. And so I went for a ritual walk and I found some snow. It had just snowed in Vancouver.
Mm,
And I picked up the snow in my hand and I let out some tears at the thought of this mom dying with 2 daughters. I have 2 daughters. And I took a moment and I honored her and I honored her family. And I also honored the grief that I was holding in my heart and my body. And I imbued it into that snow and I squeezed it into a snowball and it was melting in my hand. And then when I was ready, I took a breath and I threw it deeper into the forest. And I took a deep breath and I walked home and I felt lighter. I felt like I'd
mm,
acknowledged my own version of her grief so that I wasn't going to carry that into the space that I was creating for her community. And then we had a beautiful ceremony that afternoon. It was, hard and wonderful and all the things that happen when you grieve as a community. And then afterward, on my way home, I felt like some of that grief was sticking to me a little. I felt kind of heavy with it. And so I went down to the ocean and I have I'm an ocean swimmer. It's one of my self-care and community care rituals. But I decided to go for a swim. And so I kind of amidst the snow, went down to the Pacific Ocean and swam out and let out kind of a howl and a bit of a yelp, a kind of a cry almost, just to release some of that grief from my body, expel it in some way. And I was present in that cold water for maybe about 4 minutes. And these two eagles were dancing overhead. And I noticed a seal swimming by. And again, I was present. I was in the moment. I was alive. And I came out and warmed up and went home. And I felt like I'd properly kind of closed that chapter of the holding space for this woman and her family and her community. And I think if we don't do that, then we either compound our grief and we carry it with us and we don't ever acknowledge it. And at some point it's going to fester and erupt in some shape or form. And we're not doing ourselves justice and we're going to burn out if we keep kind of operating at that pace of just like putting our head down and just trucking forward. For me, it's just really important to acknowledge our emotions on a regular basis.
Oh, that's so true. I love that advice for all healthcare workers in general, because at least I know through my training, we never talked about grief. We never talked about the fact that we ourselves grieved over patients dying and over their stories or the suffering that we saw. It's like it's as if it didn't exist and we were not going to acknowledge it or allow any space for it. And I think of what a toll that takes, as you're saying, in terms of burnout, when you carry the weight of it and yet you can't talk about it or acknowledge it in any way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's such a common thread. I talk to med students, and they talk about how it's almost drilled out of them early on to have that empathy and have that feeling and connection for others because they know that they won't be able to sustain it, and they will face burnout. And yet there's this growing wave of people that are wanting to step into that space more. And how do we acknowledge it? Because we're going to feel all this, and if we don't, we become robotic and we lose sense of our humanity. And so I think it's incredibly important to feel all these things and have ritual to access those emotions and move them. And it's not like going down or going into the forest and squeezing a ball of snow is magically going to make my grief disappear. But what it's doing is it's tangibly making it real. And in that moment, the grief I'm feeling is felt. I can feel it with my hands, with the coldness, with the water melting. As I throw it, I feel this sense of validating it and it's making it real so that it's not just in my head. It's like it's embodying it. So that I think is incredibly important for us to find ways to embody the things that we're feeling. And ritual is a wonderful tool for that.
Mm, that's such a good point. That word embodiment, I think, is so important to us because medicine now has become like a function of the intellect and the head. And so often we leave out the heart, we leave out the gut feelings, our intuition and instincts, and all the other parts of ourselves that feel and experience things that happen. So
Um,
I just love this idea of creating those special rituals, even on a day-to-day basis, for all the little things that we experience in our daily schedule.
Yeah, and that's I think of it as a call and response now because I've honed my ritual muscles so much, and my family jokes that we can't not be ceremonial. My daughter just turned 7, and of course, the night before she turned 7, we have a small family ceremony to say goodbye to being 6, because in her world, it's a huge. Not only is everybody says like, "Oh, you must be so excited about being 7," and it's what are you going to do for your party and yet there's also grief. Like she will no longer be 6. There's grief for me and her dad and her sister there, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be that grief is something that we run away from. So every year before my child turns a certain next age, we hold space for them to grieve, letting go of what that age was. And maybe they learn things and we give her an opportunity to share what was it about being 6 that we really loved, and what are you going to carry forward into your 7th year, and what are you done with, what are you feeling like you I remember one year when she was, I think, 5 going on 6, she said goodbye to Uppy, which was being Uppy, being held.
Yeah,
And she said,
yeah.
I think I'm ready to say goodbye to Uppy. And it was this
Oh,
beautiful, like sad moment of, okay, if that's how you feel, then I'll honor that. And there's in our app, there's also a third part, which is a learning platform. So there's pre-recorded workshops and interviews with my mentors and teachers. And one of them is with Dr. Gordon Neufeld. And he talks about how for children, well, for all of us really, but for children, the end of the day is a huge time of grief. This day is now over. They'll never get it back. And the lullaby is meant to bring the grief to the surface. Lullabies are so sad, right? They're the lament, the lyrics, the tunes, the melodies. You are my sunshine. Like the words are just so hard and sad. And yet that's what's needed at the end of the night. If we bring the grief to the surface, if we acknowledge it, if we allow space for it, then we don't carry it into the next day. And I
Mm.
think as adults, we've lost that, right? If we had a bad day, we kind of push it down and, have a glass of wine and watch some Netflix and then carry it on to the next day. And we never properly acknowledge that grief that we're holding, even if it's a small grief about, you know, losing a friendship or, maybe your job changed in some way and you have some grief about that. So I love the idea of holding space every evening to just kind of acknowledge some of the grief that we might be holding so that we don't carry it with us.
And how powerful for our children and for me, grandchildren, if they start experiencing rituals. Though I imagine that children may have ways they create their own rituals in some ways through their play and things. But when we can honor these special rituals for them, we're role modeling and teaching them, and that will be something that will benefit them for the rest of their lives.
100%. And every time I work with families and there's children involved in the ceremony, I don't even need to worry about the children. The parents are always so worried. They're like, oh, I don't think our child's going to really understand this. And I do a lot of work, a lot of ceremonies for families who have lost, like with stillbirth and infant loss, and they might have an older child and they're not sure if they should incorporate that child in the ceremony or not. And my answer is I never push anybody, but I strongly recommend you include your child in this because when they get to be older, they can look back and they can know that they were part of something that helped say goodbye to their sibling or a pregnancy loss. And the parents are always so worried that the kid's not going to know what to do in that moment. And I see it every time. You just open up the door and you say, here's the ceremonial space, like go and choose something in the forest that reminds you of your sister. And you'll see them go and they'll find the most beautiful feather or the most beautiful branch, and they'll come and they'll talk about what that means to them. And the parents are just looking at this like, wow, I had no idea that they felt this all, that they were anticipating this and that they were grieving this. And nature objects, I think, are so powerful for that because we use our imagination and our creativity and yeah, children are naturally ceremonial and I love learning from them.
Yeah. So maybe even if we start by creating child appropriate rituals, we'll actually be speaking to our own inner child in a way. I mean, that's a good way to introduce rituals to ourselves and to get comfortable with the idea. And then moving forward into other rituals that work
Yeah.
for us at different times of the day.
One of my favorite ceremonies to create these days, both through the app, it's one of our more popular ones, as well as in person and online as well. I do a lot of group gatherings, is we'll create menopause ceremonies. So for women that are either in perimenopause or going through menopause, and almost always the place that we start is a first period. As we prepare to say goodbye to our menstrual cycle and all that it brought or didn't bring, we revisit our first period. And so many women and, people with and that people with menstrual cycles, they look back on that moment and they recognize that there was never any ritual and ceremony for them. And so they've been carrying that kind of grief and that craving and that need and that shame and vulnerability for, 40 some years. And so we often have to start by creating a ritual for our first period. What do you wish had happened? What do you wish we could have done? And in doing that, they're able to say goodbye to their menstrual cycle in a way that is so much more powerful because they're giving their childhood self, that adolescent, what they might have needed at that point. And the same goes with death. Oftentimes when I'm supporting families and communities, the grief that shows up isn't necessarily just about the person who died. It's about all of the losses they've had in their lives. I work with a group of women who had lost their moms at a young age. And with Hope Edelman, we were creating a way to support these women who were in the next year going to turn the age their mother was when their mother died. And they
Mm.
wanted a ceremony or a ritual to kind of cross that silent threshold of now living one day older than their mother ever got to live. And what we found in that exploration was a lot of them weren't invited to their mom's funeral because they were thought to be too young. And so my first place to start is let's create a funeral now. What's to say that you didn't miss out on your chance? Like you can do it now. You can have as many funerals as you want. You can have do-overs. You can have retroactive rituals. And when they realize they don't need permission, they can actually create the funeral ceremony that they may have needed then or what they need now. That's a huge part of that. And then they're able to think about rituals that will carry them forward as they prepare to turn that age and then the next day, one day older. And so I think there's so much power in, again, not feeling like we have to stay within this box and it has to look a certain way. And, throwing out that script and saying you can have 12 funerals for somebody. There's no saying that you only get to do it once and you have to do it a certain way. You might just choose to have different ceremonies with different groups of friends because they knew that person in different ways.
Wow, I love that. It's kind of blowing my mind, just this thought of, how many events of our lives, all the positive changes still contain pain, as you were describing, even in your wedding, and wanting to be able to make space for grief and loss, and that loss is so ever present. And if we can just acknowledge it, to ourselves, we will navigate it better. And ritual is really the perfect way of creating that space, so that to make sure we're acknowledging the loss that's present, even with every positive change that's happening.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'll add to that is that we often, when we're creating a ceremony, let's say it's a funeral of some kind, we often expect or want everybody to have the same intention or the same need or the same result. And we get so focused on trying to create a ritual and we want everybody to feel this way. And if they don't, we feel like it failed. And I think that we really need to remove that prescriptive idea that A plus B is going to equal C, and instead say, here's a ritual for us all to do in our own way. And here are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can also adapt it to suit yourself. I remember I created a virtual celebration of life for a woman who died during the pandemic, and she loved to garden. And I got to know her through stories that people shared with me after she died. And I invited everybody to bring a flower that represented this woman to our virtual ceremony. And then at some point, I invited everybody to go in gallery view and hold the flower up and maybe share a word in the chat about what that flower represents and what it means. Like it might have been a sunflower because the woman was so sunny and cheerful, and it might have been a rose because she was classy. Like the flowers have their own symbolism. So we could have ended the ritual there, but instead what I did, some people didn't bring a flower, which was totally okay. I invited them to imagine what flower they might have found or might have brought. Again, making sure nobody feels like they did it wrong. But then what I did is I invited everybody, once they logged off of Zoom, they were likely going to be feeling a lot of, maybe feelings of isolation or loneliness or their own grief, and they weren't sure how to acknowledge it. I said, take your flower for a walk. And along the walk, maybe you place it on a bench or you throw it into a pond, or maybe you bury it, or maybe you dry it and bring it home with you and put it somewhere special. Whatever you want to do with that flower is your choosing, but have your own connection with this woman. Take this flower for a walk and remember some stories, some memories, and place it somewhere that you think would honor her. And if you feel so inclined, take a photo of where you left it or what you did with it and a little story and share it back with her family. Because what a gift to find out where all these flowers made it to. And the family shared with me a few weeks later that they got the most amazing photographs and stories. Somebody had placed a flower on a bench, and as they did it, a woman walked by and asked what they were doing, and she told them, and they sat down, and she got to tell the stranger all about her friend who she hadn't seen in
Mm.
3 years, and she got to talk about her to a stranger. And this woman just had tears in her eyes and was so grateful. And she left that rose there, and she just felt like she was able to fulfill and complete that ritual by sharing that story. Somebody else said that they had thrown their flower into a nearby pond, and over the course of the week, they would go for a walk every day with their dog, and they would pass by that pond. And so every day they would see that flower and see how it had floated and shifted, and eventually they didn't see it anymore.
Mm.
But how that reminder every day that that flower was still there, that acknowledged the grief that they were carrying with them. So I think there's so many ways to take our rituals for a walk and not have it be something that we need to kind of everybody has to do the exact same thing in the exact same way. Giving people that creativity and that permission to, again, color outside the lines a little bit and make it meaningful to you.
Yeah, and not only do they serve those of us who've experienced the loss, but it becomes part of the legacy of the person who has died in a way. If you think about it, their stories, their impact is having this ripple effect when people do take it out into the world. And I think, wow, that's really beautiful. And what a gift to give to someone you love who, who's left the physical realm, and to be able to honor them in that way through the ritual. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know you mentioned the waffle Sundays. I was curious if there are other rituals that involve food, because food seems so powerful to me as well, culturally and in so many of our celebrations.
Yeah. And again, for me, the creativity of being a ceremonialist comes in talking with the family or the community or the person that I'm supporting and picking up on their language and their symbols and then responding with a ritual that they never might have thought of themselves. And I remember I was doing a wedding during the pandemic, and it was a second wedding for an older couple, and it was pandemic time, so they could gather, I think, 15 people in person, and then their families were back in England. They were both British, and they wanted to create a ritual that would connect everybody together. And so, in talking with them, I learned about how important a cup of tea is, having a cuppa. And they also live on the Sunshine Coast of Vancouver, and they both love pottery. So I suggested that we find a local ceramicist, and out of one big chunk of clay, the same clay, she made 40 little teacups. And then we worked with a local tea sommelier to custom blend a tea that he then packaged up in little packages with their favorite scents and flavors. And we mailed everybody a teacup and the special tea blend. And so the families in England that were going to be joining this virtual ceremony, and you can adapt this to a funeral, to a coming of age ceremony. It can be anything. But this idea of family in England, physical people in, near Vancouver, and halfway through the ceremony, I invited everybody to find their teacup in person or in their own homes and across England. I think a few people were in the States as well. And to pour their tea and just notice the colors kind of steeping through. And there was like a kind of a heavy red kind of tint to the tea. And I shared the story of the teacup and where it came from and how everybody was now connected because all of these teacups were made from the same family of clay. And then we told the story about the tea. And then I invited everybody to take a sip together at the same time and just to feel that kind of tea moving through their body and turn it into a ritual moment. And as they're doing so, think about an intention or a blessing for the couple to be. And as they kind of just took some quiet teas, we didn't rush anybody. I invited them either to write it down on paper physically or in the chat virtually. And then we read out these blessings that kind of showed up.
Mm.
And people told me after, they said, I never would have thought of what I shared had we not slowed down and taken that tea together. And the people that weren't physically connected, they said, I felt like I was there with you. I felt like I was present because we were all doing a sensory experience that was inviting us to connect beyond the screen, beyond the things that kind of disconnect us. And that's some of the essential elements. I do a ceremonial training that I take people through where I teach them how to build and craft ceremony. And one of the main ingredients in ritual and ceremony is the sensory connection. So our sense of taste and touch and sight and sound and the way that we experience this world. If we can weave those into the ritual items, then we have such a deeper experience.
Wow, that's amazing. You're so creative. I'm so impressed with these ideas you come up with. And so
Well,
for
they're all in the app. That's the
that's
great thing.
yeah, I was gonna say for those of us who like can't think in the moment of what could I do, the app sounds like the perfect way to get an inspiration or an idea when we need it in the moment. But the more we use it, the more we practice rituals, the more likely we are probably to think of things and have our own ideas arise.
Yeah, and it's also a collaborative experience, right? Like I will do a ritual for the first time ever because of a family that I am supporting. I've shared this story before, but I was supporting a mom whose son had died. He was an adult son, and he worked in HVAC, and so he was kind of a big burly guy. And in interviewing people after he died to learn about him and share stories, every single person told me about he gave the best hugs. He gave those kind
Mhm.
of bear hugs where he would hold on a little bit too tight and a little bit too long, and he would get a little shifty, but he just kept holding you. And it was like his MO, right? His thing that everybody talked about. So I asked his mom, I said, I want to weave this into the ceremony. Do I have your permission? And she said, yes, 100%. So I get in front of 200 or so people, many of which are big burly men who work in HVAC. And I share, I'm like, I'm going to invite everybody in a moment to close your eyes and to wrap your arms around yourself or the person next to you and picture this young man giving you a hug. And you can see people kind of looking at each other like, what is this girl talking about? This feels weird. But, I asked them to humor me and I said, you don't have to. You can also imagine it happening. You can go off to the side. Like I tried to give them not prescriptive, right? Lots of open invitations. And I said, just take a couple of deep breaths. And I could see it happen this moment within the ceremony. We'd been talking and sharing stories for about 40 minutes so far, and everything was kind of at the surface still. And in that moment, everybody kind of closed their eyes and you could see them start to give themselves a big hug and take a breath and hug deeper and tighter, and then open their eyes and look to the person next to them and hug them, just like this young man would do, holding a little bit tighter. And you could see this moment where the emotion just kind of burst through. And the tears came and the laughter came, and people got into big clumps of friends hugging each other and crying and laughing. And again, this emotional response is what we should have. We need to create space for these emotions, especially at a celebration of life, especially at a funeral. And, it only took about 5 minutes or so, but that moment allowed us to access the deeper meaning of why we were gathering today. And that ritual wouldn't have worked at somebody else's ceremony because the only reason it worked was because of how he gave his hugs. And that was such an intense, integral part of who he was. And so that's for me what I'm looking for when I interview and craft ceremonies. I'm like,
Mhm.
what's the thing that made this person unique and meaningful and their legacy, their impact? And how can we have a ritual respond to that to bring it to the surface?
So beautiful. And yes, it was his story. And everyone knew that story. Everyone knew that about him. I was just thinking of how many people I hear tell me that they don't like funerals. They've been traumatized by funerals and they never felt like the funeral itself related to the individual who had died. It just felt like something, some script that someone was reading. And how sad that is. What an opportunity has been missed because you created a ceremony that was life changing, really transformative for everyone there. You helped everyone with their own grieving process, wherever that was or however it was taking shape. And it's just beautiful. It's so phenomenal. And
Thank
I
you.
just find this so exciting. And I feel like everyone out there who's doing work in this area has to be intrigued. Like, I need to learn more about this. So tell us first about where can people get the app if they're interested in having the app.
Yeah, so beceremonial.com is our website, and then you can log in and create the app like in a URL, like in a web browser. So you don't need to actually download it from the App Store if you don't want to. You can use it as a web-based. That works especially well because apps aren't always available in all countries around the world. So, we have people in Palestine and Ukraine, in Tanzania, in Chile. We have people all over the world using it, and a lot of them will have to access it through the web-based browser, or you can go into your app store, so Apple or Google, and download the app for free. And there's lots of free things that you can explore in the app, or you can activate a membership or a subscription, monthly or annual. I think in the States it's $59 a year, so it's about $5 a month. So for us, accessibility is incredibly important. So there's the app that kind of offers you the tools at your fingertips. There's also the learning environment within the app, so you can watch recorded workshops, interviews with my mentors and teachers. We're continually adding people into that space, and it's really phenomenal. And then we also offer kind of trainings and online courses So coming up, I'm doing a year of seasonal ceremony where I'm inviting a community of people to come together at four turning points throughout the year. So March 22nd, 2025 will be our spring ceremony. And then we'll have a summer ceremony, a fall, and a winter. And it will be the same group of people. And we'll talk about the importance of acknowledging the change of seasons and how we can use ritual to move through these cycles. And really what it's about is gathering and witnessing each other and sharing where we are in the world. We have somebody joining in the Southern Hemisphere, so we're going to be kind of flipping the seasons around a little bit, which I love. Um, and then in April, I'm launching my 6-week ceremonial training. So if people really want to get deeper into this work and learn more stories, not only from me, but also from each other, it's a beautiful community experience to go through these 6 weeks with others. We're usually about 20 or 25 people who come together to learn from each other. And then I host free monthly workshops every month for our members and for our communities I spotlight different people. Coming up, I've got one with a transgender ceremonialist. We're looking at the role of ritual in gender transitioning, which is so incredibly important, especially for families and communities that aren't quite sure how to grieve and also honor and celebrate that shift in identity. And then I'm coming together with a mentor of mine on March 24th, and we're creating a ritual for Canadians and Americans. So I am in Canada, you're in America. All of that just seemed so normal. And yet suddenly in the last few weeks, I'm grieving a lot. I'm grieving about my relationship with America. And I think my American friends are feeling the same. We're being divided through our political kind of systems, and we are so much more similar and connected than we ever can know. So the hope in this ceremonial gathering is to create space for us to share some of the things that we're grieving. I won't be traveling to the States at any point, probably for the next few years. It's just a reality in Canadian life right now. And I'm grieving that. And I'm grieving my friendships and the people that I know in the States that are struggling so much. So how can we hold space for that? And so that's going to be that free ceremonial gathering. And yeah, I am always looking for opportunities to have these hard conversations in really intentional and meaningful ways. So if there's things that people want to hear more about, then I'm open to ideas and collaborations. And we can't do this work alone. I think that's what you and I know instinctively to be true, is it takes a village. And if we're going to shape and shift the culture, especially around death and dying, the way that we need to work together.
And it seems like this year is the perfect year to do extra training for someone who's already working in this arena, to add a little bit of extra training because we really do need more rituals and more ceremonies to help us as we make lots and lots of transitions and deal with a lot of grief going on around us. So it's really perfect timing, and I'd love to see people signing up for what you're offering and getting the app. And I've just been so excited, as I said, ever since I learned about it. I find myself every day I'm thinking of little rituals. I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter, and even thinking with her of little rituals we can do together as she's dealing with emotions and temper tantrums, and you know it's just so valuable. It's so important, and it makes all the difference for us to
Yeah.
kind of open our minds and live in this space in a way of remembering ritual and the value it offers.
Yeah, it's interesting the feedback I get from people with the app. I don't, since it's a weird thing to put your passion and your knowledge into an app and then have it be disseminated into the world and not know how people experience it. It's been quite disconcerting for me to kind of flip around because usually I have so much direct feedback from the families and communities that I support. And I also love that there are people around the world that are accessing these tools and making them their own. But sometimes people will share back their experiences with me, and I love hearing it. And recently, somebody shared there's a simple ritual in the daily rituals. In the morning, there's like morning, afternoon, evening, and bedtime rituals. And in the morning section, there's 6 rituals to choose from. And one of them is called 2 feet. And she shared how she's not somebody who could ever have like an extensive morning ritual practice. Like it just doesn't work with her life. But the 2 feet ritual she's been doing every day for the last 3 months, and it has shifted so much in her. And all it invites you to do, and there's a bit of a guided script that you can follow, or you can go off script. Um, But it's the very first thing you do in the morning as your right foot hits the ground and then your left foot hits the ground when you get out of bed. You say the same words. So it might be thank and then you, or it might be, two words that you're feeling in that moment, holding a moment of grief, holding a moment of joy, but using that opportunity of when your foot touches the ground as you prepare to get up and face your day, to be
Mm.
intentional with how you step out of bed. And she said it just shifted so much. She's like, it's my favorite ritual because it's so easy. I don't have to prepare for it. And if she forgets a day, that's fine. Again, we're throwing out that idea of having to be structured and strict with it all. But she said it shifts so much for her to wake up that day and have that kind of moment of gratitude for being alive, for being in her body, for being able to step out of bed that way. And it just kind of sets her up for a day. And I love hearing stories like that because it really should be simple. And if it's becoming too complicated and performative and you're worrying too much about what others think, like you're losing that intention. You have to just come back to what's important to you and what matters and what you need now in this moment. So that's my greatest hope right now is just to remind people that they have this inside of them and it can be really simple. And sometimes you just have to start. Don't worry about getting it perfect.
Mm. That's such a good thought to end our conversation on. And I encourage everyone to go to beceremonial.com to learn about all the trainings that we mentioned, and I'll put links to everything in the show notes. But Megan, thank you so much for everything that you're doing, all the work that you and your husband have done to create the app, and all of this amazing teaching that you're offering, and what a wonderful difference you're making in the world.
Oh, thank you, Karen. Well, right back at you. And it's so wonderful to feel this connection across the borders and to realize that we're all just seeking so many similar things right now. And the human experience, right? And ritual can help us just feel more alive, even as we're surrounded by death. So that's my hope. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I look forward to collaborating with you more in the future. I know there's going to be something that comes from this wonderful connection.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you and best wishes in your work as you go forward.
Thank you.